with a Ph.D. with distinction from Dalhousie University, has been a professor at the University of British Columbia since 1999, teaching Asian and Trans-Pacific International Relations. His work was based at the Institute of Asian Research and the Liu Institute for Global Issues, which are both located in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And on January 1st, 2021, Dr. Evans was appointed the HSBC Chair in Asian Research. And I can see from Dr. Evans' bio here, I could go on, but you're not here to listen to me. So Dr. Evans, Paul, I'm turning it over to you, and I'm going to mute myself.
Well, excuse me. Is my voice coming through all right for everyone? Yeah. Great. And thank you, David and Larry, for the invitation to be with you tonight. I didn't realize when we picked the date that this is New Year's Eve. I don't know if you've been having your dumplings and celebrating the Lunar New Year, which starts tomorrow. They have a multi-day celebration, and in China, this is the big holiday. As I heard someone today describe it, it's for at least some of us, Christmas on steroids, in the sense of a huge celebration of foods and families and enormous migrations within China. This week is traditionally in China in the last 20 years is the biggest migration of people in any country in a one-day period. You know, you get something like 160 million people on the move to see family members. So we're meeting at on an interesting evening. Lots going on in the world and lots going on in relations with China. And I couldn't help but note, as you were all settling in, that the first topic of conversation was weather and what we're living through at this stage. And there was a mention of COVID, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later as a key factor in the world. But before beginning, as I look through who's with us in the 50 or so people, I think I saw Dennis Pavlich, my former colleague at UBC. He was in the law school. And it's a pleasure to see you again, Dennis. I can't see you on the screen right at this moment, but it looked like you were accompanied. Mm-hmm. And it also looked like the Temple Sholom Men's Club has a very broad definition of what men mean. We've got a number of women, and I suspect maybe some youngsters, some children. And if it's at all like my teaching, when I do, all of us are teaching on Zoom now. This is the mode of instruction at UBC. I've been surprised who sit in on some of our sessions. We have some very well-educated dogs, cats, little brothers, aunts, and grandparents who are getting free tuition and sitting in on our classes. So pleasure to see everyone this evening. We're on the edge of the year of the ox. And the ox is a creature known for strength, durability, solidity. I think we're going to need some oxes going into the coming year as the world reacts to a more assertive China. And as a Biden administration in the United States stakes out its China policy. And as we all realize, China isn't a place over there. China is everywhere, and China is here on Canadian doorsteps in ways we like, in ways that cause problems, concerns, threats as well. But globally, this is the era of global China, a China that is important in its own right, but is important to almost all parts of the world in ways good, bad, ugly, and beautiful. When I was a student, my first trip to China was in 1976. And I went and we had a visit, and that was the stage, just the end of the Cultural Revolution. It was a time when, before Mao Zedong had died, he was tottering by that stage. But it was, to think of the China then and the China now is like thinking of two different worlds. But what they do have in common, China then and China now, is a Marxist-Leninist communist political system, large population, and a very capable set of people. And tonight I thought that what I might do in an informal, kind of relaxed presentation, look at the setting of dealing with this global China now. Not the China of 1976, but the China of 2021. Look at the China of 2021, the global China, in the context of what I framed as Cold War. Now, I wasn't sure when we worked on the title for this evening if it should be Cold War with China, question mark or exclamation mark. We're at one of those moments in history where things can go a number of different directions. And at the heart of some of those forces in play, China is, to me, at the top of the list, along with the United States. I teach a course at UBC, a couple of courses, and on the subject of global China and world order. And for the last year, the course, excuse me, the course has been focused on global China and world order, the crisis of world order. And we've looked at three interactive forces that seem to be defining the year 2020, and I suspect they're going to be very forceful into the next decade. The first of those forces was Cold War confrontation between the United States and China, and the great power rivalry that is increasingly defining not just their relationship with each other, but the structure of power and authority in the world. The second force that we looked at was COVID, and ways in which COVID was affecting China, China's place in the world, for better and for worse. We looked at COVID in the context of how China has been first into COVID and is first out, and that this is important to the people of China. It's important to the people of the world, the controversies around how China managed the issue, how other countries have responded, huge levels of controversy. But fundamentally, it is shifting even faster the balance of power. China is more important. Its economy is growing at even during the COVID year, Chinese economy grew approximately 3%, which stands in contrast to the United States that contracted by about 6%. So there's something going on there. And China's ability to connect into other countries in deeper ways than it has in past. And again, some of this is positive and some of this is quite concerning. But the third factor in my course on China and the world focused on climate change. And the issue that my students, and probably many of us in the room this evening, or in the different rooms this evening, think is pretty close to the top of global issues we're confronting. And certainly my students feel that way. And how China is, how COVID has affected it, its conflict with the United States, how it's affected China's approach on climate change, and what that means for all of us in trying to deal with an issue that is much bigger than the United States, much bigger than China, and that affects us all. But after the course was finished, and as I was preparing for this evening, I'm not sure the words Cold War are the right way to describe the nature of the US-China relationship. as it is unfolding. And the reason I'm hesitant about using the phrase Cold War is that it summons up to our minds the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Cold War that most of us remember as something that was a defining force after the Second World War in our lives from the late 40s until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990. And we use Cold War, and it's an easy concept to hold on to and then apply to China, US now. I'm not sure it works. I think it doesn't work in part because China is not the Soviet Union. China is not Russia. It's a different culture, different history, different civilization, different economy now, different scale. In many ways, China is a more formidable challenger to the United States or an existing world order than the Soviet Union was. It's also not always such a good phrase, excuse me, because of the Soviet Union and the United States were never deeply connected economically, around the edges, some trade. But China and the United States, China in the world, China is deeply integrated into the American economy. China is deeply integrated into the world economy as a producer, as a importer, as a manufacturing hub, as a shop floor for the world, global supply chains, etc. This is not an isolated place where we can easily disentangle from China. And the United States and China, I'll come back to some of the ways some of that decoupling, disengagement is happening, but it is a very deep form of integration, which never existed with the Soviet Union. And finally, and this is maybe a little more controversial, I don't think the Cold War metaphor works because in many people's minds, it's the experience of the defeat of the Soviet Union and the collapse of its system because of its competition and its confrontation with the United States and a pretty well organized group of allies. I think that from the perspective of the year 2021, China is not necessarily for being defeated. If each year, as I teach this course, I ask my students a question. I say, where do you think, what do you think is going to be the most important economy in the world in 10 years? Well, increasingly, my students say China with some accuracy. But more importantly, when I ask them what is going to be the world's most powerful country, it's divided, but increasing numbers say China. So that idea that China can be defeated in a Cold War, it's a possibility, but it is not a good bet. Everyone would lose if we move into that kind of partition and conflict. But it's not clear that the Chinese wouldn't survive in ways that the Soviets simply couldn't. So if we don't call it a Cold War, how do we capture this current situation that is not necessarily containment of China, but that is certainly involves what the Trump administration calls, excuse me, strategic competitor, which some call the confrontation between the two countries, and what Mr. Biden referred to last week as a policy the United States is pursuing of extreme competition with China. So the words sort of all get at the same thing, the challenge, the threat that is posed by China, but they may be a little bit better than a phrase towards or in a new Cold War with China. We all think Cold War is better than hot war, but Cold War might not be the right way to capture the kind of situation we're living in. Well, but the elements of a extreme competition between the two worlds, the world's two great powers, are already pretty evident on a number of fronts. Militarily, buildups on both sides, China, by sometime this year or next year, is going to have the world's largest Navy. Within 3 years, it's going to have 3 aircraft task forces, carrier groups. It is developing sophisticated weapons in the air, hypersonic missiles, etc. And the United States is adjusting from its nuclear policies through to its conventional arms, a pivot, a focus on China as a threat, the #1 threat that needs to be addressed in a military fashion. Economically, the United States and China still are in the midst of a trade conflict that they came to a certain kind of compromise or agreement, but that those tariffs are still in place, that the United States is still looking at areas to restrict, sometimes punish China for its trade practices, and is encouraging, we'll see how far Biden continues it, but encouraging companies to move out of China, to move to other parts of Asia or come back, something that is a kind of what's sometimes called economic decoupling. I think one of the most important areas where there is already extreme competition is on the technology field. Advanced technologies that computer chips that the United States is now refusing to sell or transfer to China, technology restrictions on research collaborations, export control items, a long list put in place by the Trump administration, but very likely most of them to be continued. And the one most obvious example that Canadians are familiar with is the issue of Huawei and technology, advanced technology in the 5G field. That's an example of where in this contemporary era, the United States is challenging China, restricting Chinese, certain elements of the Chinese economy, which they see tied into the military, and in which China is retaliating and going in its own directions in Made in China 2025. So on technology, the area we thought was the open field for open science, open exchange, is increasingly becoming bifurcated between in areas of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biopharmacy, and other areas. This is it isn't open market conditions any longer. And not complete, and there's many fields that are still open, but those several doors are being closed. Diplomatically, in international institutions, fascinating reading the assignment given to the new American ambassador to the United Nations. And it's how to stop China's increasing influence in UN and its different agencies, partly by bringing the US back in, but also by pushing back against China. Ideologically, a competition between systems. When we get major American leaders and their Chinese counterparts talking about the other as a kind of existential threat, that just doesn't mean to American officials that China has military capabilities, diplomatic capabilities, but that it is undermining democracy, that it is, in the words of some, trying to make the world safe for autocracies. That's framing not just a conflict between two states, but between two different kinds of systems, which are in, at least in some people's minds, in a kind of existential battle for survival and also for dominance of ideas. A Chinese model of development versus an American-inspired model that we in Canada know a great deal about, is based on freedom, democracy, human rights. Even when America doesn't act on its own values, it has a pretty clear value set that is not consonant with Chinese values. Well, in that sense, the world is beginning to look a little bit like that Cold War checkerboard, of where a Chinese gain is seen as an American loss. Whereas we saw very interesting, Mr. Biden President Biden had a group to get into the White House where they were talking about infrastructure development in the world and how China's investment in its Belt and Road Initiative, in the enormous amount of money and know-how that it's putting into connective systems that it finances, that it works on with 80 countries around the world. Biden came in to say, it was really interesting, not that we need to help those countries, work with those countries to develop, but we need to do that to counter Chinese expansion and influence. And so when you start seeing developments diplomatically, economically in many places of the world as being a zero-sum game between the United States and China, that's something coming pretty close to a Cold War or extreme competitiveness attitude. Well, why are we here? Why have the United States and China come to this loggerhead and this confrontational approach to each other? For some years, I was at Harvard University and worked with a man named Graham Allison. And Graham was the dean of the Kennedy School of Government. And Graham has recently published a book called The Thucydides Trap. And the Thucydides Trap, a lot of Americans are starting to say, how did we get here? How did we get into this confrontation with China? Well, there's a lot of explanations, but one that is pretty powerful is a structural explanation. And that's a change in power, and that the Chinese have generated influence, have generated economic weight, and that the balance of power between the United States and China is shifting. And in what Graham's book, The Thucydides Trap says is that this is a very dangerous situation in which a new rising power challenges an existing stronger power that is seen to be in decline. And Thucydides, that Greek historian, talked about the origins of the Peloponnesian War as rooted in the rise of Athenian power and the fear that it created in Sparta. Well, that rise of Chinese power and the fear that it is creating in the United States and in a variety of other countries is a pretty powerful precondition. We haven't had this kind of shift in global capabilities since the United States surpassed Britain and Germany and other countries at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, this doesn't mean America's in irrevocable decline, rather unlikely, nor does it mean that China's influence is going to grow to be greater. That isn't the case either. But it does indicate that in their relative capabilities, suddenly the United States has a peer competitor of a sort that it hasn't since it came into global prominence more than a century ago. There's other reasons for this confrontation too that have to do with developments inside China. China now is not the China of 1976. It's not even the China of 2018. Inside China, Xi Jinping's China is more repressive. It is centralizing power in the party over not just dissidents and the Chinese people, but over businesses. This is a consolidation, a kind of reconsolidation on a Marxist-Leninist basis. And Xi Jinping is in control in a way that no Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping has been, and with characteristics of increasing attempts to control events from within inside his office and under his leadership. And so we've got a more repressive China in general. And there's numerous examples of a government that is not moving in the direction of more pluralism, but of more centralization and more authoritarian control at the center. We have specific Chinese actions that point to this. Some of them are in Xinjiang, that western province of China, where the Uyghurs are the object of a concerted Chinese program for re-education, what some will call genocide, but which at a minimum, without arguing the term, is an effort to exert a new Han identity on a population on a minority population, and with no apologies for what is being done. There is internally a very powerful argument for why the Xi Jinping's government is pursuing these policies, and we can get into it later if you'd like the explanation. But to many Chinese and to those in the outside world, this is a kind of step in repression that signals something new and potentially very dangerous down the road. Already difficult and dangerous, more so in future. When we see what has happened in Hong Kong with the national security law that was passed in July, a reaction to the student protests and the other protests, demonstrations, from the Chinese perspective, violence out of control. The reaction through the national security law has had a huge impact on people's views of China, not just because of what it does for Hong Kong, but the extraterritorial application about dissent, succession, terrorism, the things they're afraid of anywhere in the world. At the University of British Columbia, every one of our syllabi, what we put out, our courses, have a section in it this year, essentially without naming it, having the national security law in China in mind in our syllabi, which was particularly for our students who were taking our courses remotely, as we're speaking this evening, that a warning that while they were on the Zoom or in other forms of communication, that their work and their ideas could be surveilled, particularly if they were resident in China, in the mainland, or if they were planning to visit or go back there later. So I use that. We can talk about whether we've overreacted. I don't think so. But we could talk about what the implications of that are. They are very significant. That national security law causes anger, knees to wobble a wee bit, people fearful in ways they haven't been before. It shows the power, but also the determination of China to act forcefully in preserving its sovereignty and what it sees as its national interest. Hong Kong is becoming, it's always been partially a Chinese city. It is becoming incorporated into the mainland's authoritarian rule in important ways in a day-by-day basis. And I think there's been particular worry about Xi Jinping's policies with reference to Taiwan and the South China Sea. South China Sea, we don't need to get to tonight. Well, we might if you wish. But Taiwan, the new pressures on Taiwan, this desire, the concept that reunification may come sooner rather than later. There are reasons for real anxiety because of what is going on inside China and some of its assertive policies. China, if assertiveness essentially means hard action taken with self-confidence. China feels, its leadership, that it is not the world's dominant power, or probably ever would become that, but that its leadership is of the view that the United States is weakened, that it may not have a long period of time. China won't itself because of demographic changes in the country, and that this is a moment where it can act boldly and defiantly in ways that it hasn't in past, or has been restricted, self-restricted since Mao Zedong. The other big reason for why we are where we are is because of developments in the United States. And in the Trump administration in particular, although it's much deeper than Trump, the view that China is a challenger, not only economically, technologically, militarily, diplomatically, all the things we've said, but that China is in some ways a deeper competitor to the United States. And it is because this is not the China that can steal, copy, reproduce, muscle its way into stronger technology and a stronger economy. This is because of a China that can innovate. And I mentioned technology earlier. I think the most important part of the US-China conflict now is around technology. Who is going to dominate, control, play the most influential role in the rollout of all of the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution? To China, technology is power and the way to escape being a second-tier economy, but also political power in the world. It was Western technology that brought China to its knees in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. It will be technological power that will allow China to be wealthy and prosperous in future. China isn't the technological giant, but there are a number of fields where it is advancing very, very quickly. And the fear that this causes, I think, fundamentally in the United States is a powerful worry to America. You know, a few years ago when I'd ask people, you know, is China going to become a peer competitor of the United States? My American friends, very thoughtful people, would say, yeah, big scale. They may have an economy bigger than ours soon, but we fundamentally hold the keys to technological innovation, and that China can imitate, but essentially it can innovate. It cannot innovate because of its political system and because of its cultural backwardness in education and other things. That was 5, 6, 7 years ago. Ask that same question of my same friends now. And it's the China that can innovate that is causing deep concern in that the innovation is the key to the 21st century economy, and that China needs to be restricted, pushed back. And the phrase is decoupled. We need to start breaking off scientific exchanges. In the United States, there's been restrictions on the kinds of students from China that can come in now. These policies are under review, but the general idea is to maintain American preeminence. And we've been all wondering about, with the Trump administration gone and the bombastic kinds of language, the direct criticisms of China, the confrontation, pretty blunt stuff. My sense is that a Biden administration is going to be different. It already is. It has very experienced, highly trained, highly competent people in positions of authority. It has in Tony Blinken, one of those just extraordinarily thoughtful people. You might not agree with them, but they've got a professional team in. They also have said that China has to be framed as a competitor, extreme competitor, but that it also needs to be looked at from the perspective of cooperation on the big global issues, climate change, energy, maybe even things like proliferation and North Korea. So there's areas where you have to cooperate. So in tone and in rhetoric, it'll be different. But everything we have seen from this administration in its first, roughly month has been, even as it's reviewing its China policy, it is going to be fairly tough and fairly confrontational with China on several fronts. And the one example I would give already is the view of Mr. Blinken and the increasing numbers of the US administration that what China is doing in Xinjiang should be labeled genocide. That is, there's a lot that comes with that. The approach is not going to be a lot softer. It may find areas for cooperation, but that competition element is going to be very strong. There's a consensus, an extraordinary consensus in the United States that's bipartisan. I mean, one thing Republicans and Democrats can agree on is who can use some of the harder words to condemn particular kinds of Chinese actions. And across sectors, even in the business sector, well, business has big business in China, huge investments, activities with it. The general framing of China as at least big part of that framing as China as competitor is widespread. So I think we're going to see some differences on some issues than where Trump was positioned. Certainly, the Biden administration is going to pay more attention to its allies. Its efforts to beat back Chinese trade policies failed. The tariffs have failed to achieve, if the desire was just to get China to the negotiating table so they would buy more American goods, they worked. But if the objective of those tariffs was to try to pressure structural changes in the Chinese economy, that's failed. And I think the Biden people are wanting to come in and form alliances, coalitions, work with their partners, instead of battling with the Canadians and the Europeans, try to find some common ground for common pushback against China. But in terms, that fundamental terms of China as adversary, 80% of it is still going to be in place. This is the era of competition. Well, let me conclude by talking about what that might mean from a Canadian angle. What are some of the issues that we as Canadians need to address in this era of strategic competition, extreme competition between the United States and China? And I guess I'd frame it this way. I'm uncertain of whether these new storm clouds, the thunder and the lightning that we're seeing for Canada is going to be a matter of some bad weather for a while in our relations with China, or as if it's an example or a new era of climate change. And what I mean by that is that we're going to systematically have to reassess what we want in our relations with China, how we want to get there, and that this, what is not just a dark day or week or month, could be a dark decade ahead. I'm tending to the latter, and I want to give two examples tonight that I suspect are on your mind as they are mine. And the first one of those is our two Michaels, the two Canadians that are in detention in China, and the use of hostage taking as a diplomatic tool, as a coercive tool by the Chinese. This is not new. It's happened with some other Canadians at an earlier point, but also with citizens of other countries. But it's a pretty nasty form of diplomacy. Now, we need those two Michaels out, but we are not going to get them out until we deal with the third M, and that's Meng Wanzhou. And her detention here on the basis of an extradition agreement with the United States. And as we all know, her case is moving before the courts, before Justice Holmes, and that we will be getting probably a much clearer situation of where this is going to land next March when the abusive process is considered. But I mention this because let's just imagine for a moment that we were able to find a way that Madame Meng goes back to China. This is tied to a series of agreements or understandings that also lead to the release of our two Michaels. This is a happy scenario. I'm not sure how likely it is at this point, but it's a happy scenario. Let's assume that happened. Does that mean the Canada-China relationship is going to go back to what it was, say in October 2018, when we were considering a free trade agreement with China, when we were looking at all kinds of ways to open our doors to more Chinese students, to Chinese investment, potentially even in Huawei in our 5G system? Are we going to revert back to that engagement period? And my answer is, I don't think so. That I think here in Canada, public attitudes have soured, not just because of these issues, but also because of certain Chinese actions, as we've mentioned, in Xinjiang, in pressuring on Taiwan, but also because of rising Canadian concerns about Chinese influence and interference activities here in Canada. Not many Canadians go as far as seeing China as an existential threat to our democracy, but it is evident that certain kinds of values of academic freedom, for example, certain things about protection and non-interference and harassment of dissidents or Chinese Uyghurs or others who are critical of regimes or policies in China. These all add up to, I think, a different atmosphere. And I think fundamentally that as Canada looks at this confrontation between the United States and China, we see a new China. We see a United States that we still are not sure we can trust, but we may be able to work more closely with. And, that in that context, we're going to be looking at a new framework for dealing with China. Now, I have a hunch that we've all been waiting for the Liberals to come up with their China framework or statement or their China policy. What's going to replace the engagement strategy that we used pretty consistently from 1970 until very, very recently, had a 50-year run. They haven't, but we're going to see a major release, I understand, on Monday of what might be the ingredients of a new Canadian approach. And I think it is going to be an approach that is going to identify China as competitor, as threat. Any of you who heard David Vigneault, the head of CSIS's comments 3 days ago, that China is a major external threat to Canada. I think we're going to see that kind of vocabulary. At the same time, we're going to see that there are multiple areas where we must cooperate with China. Some of those are around some commercial activities, but the fundamental ones are around dealing with the great transnational issues. Climate change, maybe peacekeeping, energy supply. China is in the world in a way it can't be ignored. And I think that the tune, the melody beneath this new framework is going to be that we're no longer in the business of changing China. We might want to change some of its behaviors, but the idea that openness was going to bring democracy or even pluralism to China, maybe, but not now. So that from engagement's emphasis on change, inducing change in China, that the new emphasis is going to be how we live with China. Not a China we like, not a China we always trust, some areas we might, but it has to be looked at in a very hard-nosed, cold, calculating way. Cooperate when we can, push back when we must. And I think the final element that is going to be, I imagine we're going to hear more about next week, is working with others in pushing back against China in particular areas. Now, those others include the United States, but on matters like Hong Kong and what we see as the increasing kind of vice-like tightening around liberties and around the distinctive way of Hong Kong life, Canada doesn't have the capacity or the influence to stand alone on those matters. We can condemn, but that isn't going to be a very forceful pushback. It's going to be needed to be done in coalition with other countries. Now, how those are built is the fundamental question between Washington and Ottawa right now. The Americans want us to cooperate with them in pushing back against China, but we don't want to push back on all of the fronts the Americans do. Canada does not want to see the great decoupling. We are less afraid. We think that free trade, multilateral trading systems are the way to go. And we'd like to put some pressure on the Chinese to behave differently, but we don't want to get into a situation where we're pushing them out of organizations and where we're pushing them away from potential collaborations. So that new China framework is just around the corner. But I don't think that we're going to be in a position where this is going to be a happy return to the era we had before. For the foreseeable future, it's going to be hard. Let me conclude with a dinner party, not on a Chinese New Year, but a dinner party at a home in Cambridge, Massachusetts last year. And I was with a group of people who are what I would call engagers. These were Harvard faculty who felt that this was time, that this was a good time to keep the doors open. Let's have Chinese students stay with us. Let's increase our contacts with China. And at the same time, though, it was a pretty grim dinner because each of us was coming across mentioning things that disturb us in what is happening inside China in a variety of different fields, or in Chinese behavior externally. And at the dinner table, there was a lot of discussion about Xinjiang and what is really going on at the grassroots level there, what is being enacted. And all of us were clearly horrified by those. But the question was not how do we push back against China? There was some discussion there. But the issue is how long do we have to push back? Is this the fate of the modern world, that we're going to have to deal with a China that fundamentally challenges our values and our institutions? Some people were a little more positive, said, yeah, a lot of differences, but a lot of overlap in interests. And that Xi Jinping, there'll be a chance for relaxation. Not many of the audience, not many of our dinner party companions were convinced of that. We think we're in the Xi Jinping era into a pretty tough thing. But the way the optimists finished the conversation was, well, China it's going to be a rough patch in China, in the United States. We're into this dark decade. But one thing we've known about China is that it changes. We went around the room and all talked about what was China like when we first went there. Well, in 1976, it was a much more dangerous place, not as powerful a place as it is now. So the answer was, do not get into major military conflict with China. We ride this period out and hope there will be some kind of future developments that will take China in another direction. And I'm not sure that's a recipe for hope or a recipe for pessimism, but I think that's probably where we are in the year 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans.
Larry, in planning this session, Dr. Evans, Paul, I'd like to call him Paul.
Paul, please.
Indicated that he likes interactive sessions. So people have put questions into chat. I'll have people pose it themselves so that we can have multiple voices, and unmute yourself if you see yourself as muted, and pose your question. So the first up is Larry. Go ahead.
So, Paul, my question was, do you believe China is moving towards an open economy, that is to say, a more capitalistic society? But you seem to have answered it in your presentation. But the reason I asked it is because the Soviet Union, which was a command type economy, a controlled economy system, appears to have imploded on itself because of the inherent faults, if you like, within the system. What I'm struggling to understand is, if China is a closed economy or a controlled economy, why is it becoming such a powerhouse if they have perhaps the same inherent flaws in a communist type approach? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's, Larry, a fundamental question. And it goes back to that proposition I put to you at the beginning, that I don't think the Chinese economy operates on a Stalinist style command economy structure. The Chinese economy there's a tension between state control and state lead, and an extraordinarily dynamic private sector. I mean, we all can think of a number of Chinese companies, whether it's Huawei, whether it's Alibaba, some of the, I mean, there's in the top 100 companies in the world, more than half now, there's as many in China as in the United States. And so they got a form of capitalism that is operating. And I think, one of the points of fear was that their peculiar blend of sometimes state-led or state-directed, but not well, some of them are state-owned, but they operate very independently in most areas. So they've got a fusion system. And until very recently, many of us thought that the private sector side in China, which is lively, it's the principal generator of wealth, and their small and medium enterprises. It's one of the most cutthroat capitalist economies on earth at the level of producers in a whole variety of sectors, electronics to take one example. Larry, the challenge is that those of us who thought that the trajectory of Chinese companies, of the Chinese economy, was step by step, zig and zag, going to move more towards market reforms, market-based decisions. There is some evidence of that. But in the era of CCP repression, and like Hong Kong, what we're finding is that the demands of the authoritarian political system, party control, is becoming stronger. And that some of the reform impulses that even 3 or 4 years ago were quite encouraging are being pulled back. Now, the Chinese defend these by saying it's the Americans' fault. They won't give us the computer chips we need. So we're going to move a part of our economy more towards domestic kind of military-like production. That's their defense. So that right now we're all struggling to see how that conflict, that tension between party control and wanting certain political outcomes could deal with those who want to run a capitalist economy. And the example that I would give actually is Huawei, one of the great successes as a so-called private company in China. When we did research there a couple of years ago, we looked very closely at the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese Communist Party. And we came to some answers that, the state ultimately has a big influence on what Huawei does. But we said it has a large degree of independence, and it pushes back regularly against what the central state wants, including on the issue of Madame Meng. That was what Huawei was not happy with the way the Chinese government responded to this issue. But going back now and talking with my Huawei friends, they all admit that the party, in each enterprise in China, whether they're foreign or Chinese, you need to have a party cell or party committee. And it's clear that the party committee is being more active in determining what Huawei does now than it was a year or two ago. So you're asked a wonderful question, and is the state capitalism that the Chinese have had, is their model twisting now more back to the state side? And will that not then restrict its growth and other things?
Mel, you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor. It's been a very interesting talk, and mainly, I would say, dominated by your review of the American-China relationship. And I'm just wondering to what extent you consider, or do they consider, or China consider, Canada a significant player in the world scene, or do they really could just consider us, especially with regard to the two Michaels, as just a vassal state of the US?
Yeah, that's, Mel, that's certainly the projection we sometimes get. I remember that when China and Canada established diplomatic relations in 1970, 2 years of negotiations, it was the 5 members of the Politburo came to an understanding of why they were going to deal with Canada. This is 1970, 50 years ago. And Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the 2 key players in the Politburo at that stage, came up with 3 reasons why China should negotiate with Canada as compared to Italy or Belgium or some other countries. And the first was that Canada is close to the United States. The second reason they put in this famous document was Canada is somewhat independent of the United States. And their third main reason was that Canada had a different worldview about international institutions, the United Nations in particular, that could be of advantage to China. So in the sweep of things, Canada is seen as an interesting middle power by the Chinese. The emphasis is not on the word power, but on the emphasis middle. They have found it useful to interact with Canada. We've provided some kinds of things their economy needs. Excuse me. But we are not a major player. Let's then come back to your specific case of Madame Meng. The formal line from the Chinese is that the Madame Meng case and the 2 Michaels are unrelated. But in fact, everyone knows they are related, that those 2 Canadians were arrested and detained in response to the arrest of Madame Meng. And the Chinese are right in one way, and that is that the United States began the Madame Meng problem. That extradition request came from the United States. It was not initiated by Canada spontaneously. And they sometimes ask me, they say, you guys, you Canadians got thrown under the bus by the Americans in this arrest. And my answer to them is, yeah, we did. And the problem is because of the way you're reacting and grabbing those 2 Michaels. now there's a number of Canadians who want to get on that American bus and drive forward in a confrontation with you. And I think that it's funny, Mel, I think in Canada, the reaction that we've had, the Americans have caused this problem. We can't solve this problem without the United States. And this is, we're vulnerable on this one. The Chinese, I think, understand our dilemma. And until the 3 M's are the product of some 3-way understandings between Washington, Ottawa, and Beijing, even if these are done informally, there's going to be no solution to this problem. We're caught in the middle of a conflict that is bigger than us. Let me end by one positive note on this. You know, as I'm starting to think, how long are these guys going to be in a Chinese prison? I fear it's going to be at least through this calendar year because of what is going to be necessary to put in place in that deal. Even if Madam Meng, Department of Justice and Madam Meng's lawyers come to some plea bargain where she either goes to the United States or doesn't, but she can plead guilty to certain things, pay a fine. Even if that happens, that isn't automatic that our 2 Michaels are going to be released. And I think that the necessary conditions is Washington helping with the release of Madam Meng and then working with Canada on the negotiations around those the 2 Michaels and setting up some ground rules for what we do moving forward on these matters. Nobody can work with the Chinese under the overhang of their citizens being grabbed in this way. I mean, we all have to work with the Chinese, but we'll prefer not to. And so until we get some new ground rules on this, and the quid pro quo, why would the Chinese do that? It's not because of anything Canada can offer fundamentally. It's what the United States can offer. And if the Americans will alter the sanctions activity and the tools that it uses around sanctions, it's economic coercion. If we move down that path, we might be able to get our 2 Michaels back. We might be able to get Madam Meng back to China, and we might be able to find something positive out of what has been a nightmare situation.
Larry, you had a second question. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. How do you think the average Chinese citizen feels about the government? Pride, fear, resignation, apathy, this is the way it's always been, and so on. Excluding for a minute the repressed minorities, that maybe is a given, right? Rhetorical question, but the average Canadian citizen, how do they feel?
The average Chinese citizen.
The average Chinese citizen, how do they feel about their government?
Surprising and difficult for us to get our mind around. You know, there's always, Larry, ideas floating that the Chinese Communist Party is bordering on collapse. It has internal problems, COVID, a whole set of issues that China's party is close to collapse. Well, problem is that isn't what the evidence suggests. The polling that is done is stunning, and these are by good groups. These are not hoodwinked groups where Chinese feel they need to say something for political safety. The polls of multiple countries during the COVID era, trust in the Chinese government by its citizens is one of the highest trust rates in the world, ahead of most European countries, certainly far ahead of Canadians' views of how well our government is done. Do we trust our government? It's the confidence of the Chinese people in their system to provide certain kinds of goods, increasing economic well-being and public safety. Those are two things that come through, partly its education system of patriotism and all of that. But as we get beneath it and say, do you think your government is legitimate? That's seen as a dumb question by many Chinese. It's the government we have, and it is producing things that we need and want. And that I'd focus on one of them just as an example to show what that attitude, what lays beneath it, not just a calculation of self-interest, but a sense of the world. And it's the reaction to the students in Hong Kong. We looked at those demonstrations, the protests, you could call them riots, in Hong Kong. And we generally kind of cheered on the students. We thought they were pushing for a pretty good cause. Inside, as I talk with mainland friends and as I see people writing their articles and books on this now, most Chinese didn't see it that way. They saw those as precious kids that had been treated pretty well, who were violent, who were disrupting social order. And that the protest, may have had some good ideas behind it, but that the form was destabilizing and disorderly. And that, if my sense, Larry, is a fundamental Chinese fear is not fundamentally dominance by the outside. It's fundamentally disorder, violence, and chaos. And some of that is because those people who lived through the Cultural Revolution and the violence inside Chinese society when authority broke down temporarily. The memories they have of what was China in the first half of the 20th century. And Chinese youth, their emphasis on the importance of order. In that context, there's something cultural, there's something historical, and there's something about their contemporary interests. So that it's, I suspect there's a deep wellspring of desire for change in China, but it is not the form of overthrowing their government or overthrowing their political system. And it is so hard to get our mind around that because we feel there are certain primal urges towards democracy, human rights, maybe rule of law. And they're not unknown in China, but they are put in the context of some other values and historical memories that lead to some skepticism about them. And I conclude with the thought that the idea of universals, that democracy, human rights, particular freedoms, individual liberties are universal, really runs into some deep cultural differences. And in this case, China is a mixed picture. Some things they're doing are on economic development, poverty alleviation, livelihoods for individuals. That's pretty powerful stuff. But on the other things that we think make us human, that we think must be the ingredients of the good political system, I think we're dealing with a different entity and beast in the Chinese context. And getting our minds around that is very, very hard.
Sean, unmute yourself and pose your question.
Yeah, thanks. My question is more about that broader sweep of history and great powers than today's headlines. And would you agree that China's unique controls over the political system, the social system, their focus on technology under Xi Jinping, it gives them some real strategic advantages in this conflict that's coming over a United States that is divided clearly, and where the political elite, half of them are looking at their past and arguing about the Constitution from 200 years ago, and not very many of them are really looking at the future and how to maintain their position as the world's cop. Broad sweep question.
Yeah. And I mean, one way, I'm sorry, I can't see who this question came from.
It's from me, Sean Hawkins.
Thank you. Yeah, I ran an exercise with my students this year, and the grad students, in our class on global China about COVID response and what we can learn about COVID. I'm sorry, what we can learn about national power, national capabilities, and international influence because of COVID. And it led to a profound argument among my students on this matter, because one argument is pretty clear, and that is that China, despite what it did in those first months or two of the disease, controlled it better once they recognized the problem, that they were able to handle both the disease itself, the virus itself, and to keep its economy running and moving forward. And that pointed to some of the advantages in this state, in this authoritarian state in China, which is the capacity for central planning, for large-scale mobilization of resources, for mobilizing society in ways. When you look at what the Chinese did in those cities, there were draconian measures taken to limit infection, to lock people in their buildings, to contain the virus. But what's beneath that was their ability to mobilize local citizens. This wasn't because there was a policeman on every corner, but there were neighborhood patrols on every corner, that the state had the capacity to mobilize. And that, whereas in the United States, a leadership that didn't accept responsibility for the issue, that couldn't organize, where you had 50 different states, governors playing leading roles without coordination at the center. It made the Chinese system look pretty good. However, as we're seeing the kind of longer term consequences of this, their system can do some things. And there's some kinds of technologies even that they can mobilize. States can mobilize technologies. The Americans put a nuclear bomb together on the basis of a state-led enterprise for innovation in nuclear technology. The United States put a man on the moon through state-funded and directed activities. Well, the Chinese are doing those kind of things in a lot of areas. And how can that system continue? Who's going to be producing the Nobel scientists of the next decade? Where is the real innovation in natural science coming? It's very complicated to say. There are now more Chinese patents than American patents. And that now, are they good? Are they the leaders in all fields or even a few fields? Possibly. So that I don't think either Americans or Chinese are going to change their view on the superiority of their systems. That's the crash we have. I think those of us who are profs are trying to find a way to find some middle ground. I mean, when you see the Biden administration talking about what amounts to industrial policy in these high-tech areas, huge new investments in research, government-sponsored R&D activities, rather than they're taking a page out of the Chinese playbook. And curiously, us Canadians, we've had some success with state-owned enterprises in a variety of sectors too. So maybe there's some magic in the middle, but for the time being, the Chinese are showing that their system can produce some kinds of goods that at this stage are Western democracies, which are internally conflicted, to say the least, can't produce. Now, on the other hand, I would rather change a leader by election than what will be impossible in China. Xi Jinping isn't going to be elected out of office. There'd be other kinds of, so, you know, maybe in 1989 during Tiananmen Square, in 1976 during the Cultural Revolution, the flaws inside the Chinese system were apparent. At this moment, though, they're riding a little bit high.
Thanks.
The next question is from Sue Hale. Please direct your question, unmute yourself.
Good evening. How should Canada improve its Arctic defense strategy, considering that both Russia and China have strategic and economic interest in the region?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sahel, this is a top priority issue in Ottawa now. It's where a defense strategy and an economic strategy coincide. Until we've known that we have certain conflicts with the Russians in the Arctic, we have for a long time, but have found a way basically to manage them. The China factor is something new in the Arctic, partly because of melting ice and China's interest in transportation routes. It's the world's largest trader. It's the world's largest user of maritime shipping. So there's suddenly an attraction there also to the resources, but also in geostrategic terms, while China is not an Arctic country, it sees itself as a near Arctic country and is now playing, its submarines are not yet floating around in that part of the world. At least we don't think so. But there is the possibility that they do. And this is going to be a major challenge for Ottawa to maintain its expand its surveillance capabilities, to monitor more closely Chinese, Russian, and American activities in the region. This is really has taken an interesting turn. You know, we had just a few weeks ago, a Chinese company wanted to buy a gold mining operation in the Arctic. And it was investigated, and for the first time, for the first time in that sector, the Canadian government turned it down on national security terms. Gold is not a strategic commodity, but what was going to go into it, I think that around mining, more Chinese ships, more Chinese investments. I think we're starting to see a signal from Ottawa, while not a formal rule, but a signal. We don't want Chinese investment and we don't want Chinese research in the Arctic. That is a big policy shift, but it's triggered by a recognition that Chinese interests are increasing there, that their cooperation with the Russians is increasing. So that's something we have to study more carefully. Russia and China are collaborating on a whole new number of things. How much of that's in the Arctic, we don't quite yet know. I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with our Minister of Defense, who some of you in this group might be in Harjit Sajjan's riding. And I asked him, what is more important to Canada in terms of maritime security issues? What is going on in the South China Sea that we make a lot of noise about? Or what is going on in the Arctic? And in a nanosecond, he said the Arctic. And he said he feels, and I think it's widely felt in the Canadian government, that this is shifting very quickly from commercial, environmental, societal issues, and as we deal with China there, to the strategic issues, and what this is going to mean for the kinds of capacities we develop on our own, or partnerships with the Americans in new ways. That's where the strategic thinking is going.
Vince, unmute yourself and pose your question, please.
Doctor, thank you very much for the presentation. Very insightful. I think you might have already, I can guess maybe what you're going to answer, but I will pose a question. Does Canada have anything to gain with considering boycotting the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year? Does it help us strategically in any of those negotiations with the two Michaels, or are we just punishing our athletes? Thank you, and I'll listen.
Boy, thank you, Vince. This this one's really sprung up in the last few weeks in an interesting way. And my own thought on this is, I don't like boycotts of games for political reasons, pulling out of the games. But I do like the discussion around why we might consider a boycott or other pressure, because I think governments and the athletes and the International Olympic Committee, our committee, should try to be as apolitical as possible. There's 100 things to be angry with China about. It's hard, almost any other country, we could find at least 50 things to be angry about. So I like to keep as far as possible the myth or the dream of the non-political Olympics. However, it is clear they're taking place in a country and at a time where many people in the world, and certainly in our country, are deeply angry at Chinese behaviors in a variety of areas. And I think that the coverage of this, having people stand up, our NGOs and others point the finger, make the case we should get out of the games. I'm not convinced by their prescription, but I am convinced by their anger. I think we should communicate that and find every way, us academics, some of our athletes privately, how badly they feel. The question of, is this going to affect the two Michaels? In one way it might, you know, it will make things more complicated. Our government has been walking on eggshells on several issues for not wanting to inflame relations with China beyond where it is absolutely necessary. The Australians have been marvelous because they not only disagree with China and push back, they punch them in the eyes. Remember those three stooges with the two punch in the eye? They really put it in their face. Ottawa has avoided doing that. It has, on Hong Kong, it has been very critical. It has issued condemnations of China around Xinjiang. It has used some strong words, but it has created some negativity in China, but it hasn't been provocative. And the issue we face is how far we want to join in coalitions or create coalitions to criticize China. And I would think the Canadian government would do very well to avoid being seen as the lead force in a boycott. I don't think we should be supporting that in any event, but if we did, to be the lead force. And that might be a provocation that would make the two Michaels release more complicated. But I think there are ways we can manage our way through this, to express our disagreements, to show why a lot of Canadians are really deeply concerned about developments in China, but that the boycott probably would be counterproductive. I could only imagine this strengthening nationalism, that defensiveness, that combativeness in Beijing, that the world doesn't want us. As when we succeed and do things well, we get punished. That line of argument would only be reinforced if we move towards a boycott. But I really appreciate the question because we should be discussing it at the same time. I didn't mention it. I should have. I'm going to in the next talks. We talk about Xinjiang. We talk about Hong Kong, where Our government can continue to make expressions, but don't withdraw. Don't pull out. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
Yeah, Doctor, yes, I would. Because based on the discussion tonight, I don't think we're going to move the needle with China, given our position in the world, and I think we need to be a bit more collaborative about it. But I'd like to see Canada show a little bit more resolve in trying to get the two Michaels home for a number of reasons, and address some of the issues that are also angering Canadians, especially with Hong Kong and the Uyghur Muslims in China. I think those are topics of conversation amongst Canadians.
Yeah, I agree.
Doug, unmute yourself and pose your question, please.
Thanks, David. Paul, thank you very much. Fascinating talk. You've answered my posted question. I'd like to build on Suhail's point about security and national defense. So moving it away from Canada, we have formal allies in Australia and New Zealand. We likely have informal allies in the form of the Thais and the Philippines and others. Yet when I contrast our defense and procurement policy with Australia, Australia appears a decade or two ahead in protecting its interests, in building the infrastructure to protect its interests. But I'd like you to comment, please, about how you view Canada's preparedness to contribute to security in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. In the discussion with Minister Sajan recently, this was a principal issue. If to go to one dimension, which is the military dimension, there's a lot of other security issues, but the issue of military capabilities, what should be Canada's response? And I think we're now into an era of asking a question. I doubt we're going to go the Australian route of a full mobilization, 25% increase in defense spending, the acquisition of particular kinds of offensive capabilities in the maritime and the air power domain that could be for counterbalancing China. I don't think we're going to go that route, but I think there is now an awareness that we are going to need other kinds of capabilities. Some of those are going to be monitoring capabilities. A couple of naval assets we're going to need to have, particularly for Arctic operations. And that we are going to need bigger investment in cybersecurity and in space kind of based remote sensing and surveillance. And that finally, we're going to be needing to use our existing military assets, the port visits, other things we do in Asia, in a little bit different way. And that we're going to have to be more interactive with friends, sometimes with the Chinese. This cannot be always against the Chinese. Some things we'll do with them, but we do need to do more with the Japanese, with the South Koreans, and others who are countries that are also very angry and worried about China, but do not want to line up in a military containment strategy against China. So in other words, you do some balancing, but you don't do confrontation. And the hard policy issue, and we'll see what comes out in that Monday report, are we going to be involved in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea that are aimed at pushing back against Chinese sovereignty claims? I think it's possible, but we're going to do it in a very limited way. That's not where our strength lays, in being a major naval power. Where we need is a Navy that protects some of our immediate interests, and that is going to need a few new resources to move forward.
Our next question is from Dennis Pavlich. Dennis, please unmute yourself if you're muted and go ahead.
Oh, hi, Paul. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks for a very informative talk that has offered us some interesting perspectives. And I wanted to pick up just on one of those perspectives, which is your view that probably the next 10 years, we're looking more at a world of strategic competition rather than a Cold War between the United States and China. And I guess that, and I think you added, and I would agree with it, that's better than a Cold War, because competition does presuppose actually a whole lot of cooperation.
Yeah.
And I think you said at the micro level, a lot of that is happening. So my question is simply this: we focused only on the United States and China, but where does India, for example, fit in over that 10-year horizon that you mentioned earlier on?
Dennis, thank you for this. And as I say, nice to see you again. It's been a while. And I see you're with, someone's joined you this evening.
It's my dear wife, Suzanne.
Good. Suzanne, we've never met, but hello. It's nice to get to see you. How to answer that question? You know, I guess, Dennis, it's too simple to reduce the picture to a bipolar world in which it's America versus China, or America against China. That is a new and almost a defining element, but it's not the only one. We're really in a multipolar context. When we talk about the rise of China, we really should be saying the rise of Asia, with China at the center of it. The production systems coming out of COVID, I think we're finding that even as the United States wishes to pull back some of its connections with China inside the region, East Asia, Southeast Asia, those connections are being increased almost daily. Recently, there's been a trade arrangement that involved 18 countries. It's the world's largest so-called free trade agreement, the Regional Cooperation Economic Partner, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Extraordinary in its scope, not very deep, but in its scope. And so that Asia is the dynamic factor in it, of which China is an integral part, not the only part. The India question is fascinating. And as you know, there have been some border tensions between the two countries recently that are actually starting to be resolved fairly well in the last few weeks. But nevertheless, some real tensions, economic tensions between the two. My sense is that India is not a global player in the same way that those two countries are, China and the United States, or that Europe is. I mean, I think the big both counterbalance to both the United States and China is Europe in the context of trade relations and in the context of technology issues. India is still an outlier. It didn't join the Regional Cooperation, Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It has not been a major challenge to China in the United Nations and in international institutions. India has 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the kinds of organizations and issues that the United States and China are butting heads in. Start looking at the voting records of India and China in the United Nations. They're not far off. There's a certain commonality. And I'd frame it even in a broader way than this. India is a very important player in South Asia. India is a very important player in the Indian Ocean. And so far as China is now becoming much more active in the Indian Ocean, in its military capabilities, in its Belt and Road Initiative, running into countries, including Sri Lanka, into India's own zone, there are going to be tensions. But they're at a scale that is so different. I mean, the Chinese economy is so much larger and more dynamic than the Indian economy. Chinese defense spending is still only about a third of the American, but it's larger than the next 4 countries, Japan, India, and other countries in the world combined. So China is suddenly just at such a different level of capabilities and influence. In diplomacy, China is a presence in the world and an active presence in infrastructure investment, domestically and internationally. So Dennis, I think it's a multipolar world, but with tiers of those poles. And I would start with the United States and China, then Europe, then Japan, before we get to the Indians.
And would that be the case in 10 years from now?
I'm going to bet that it's going to be more the case then than it is now. And that has to do because of domestic Indian political developments and the absence of the economic growth that was anticipated. It has slowed before COVID and has dropped substantially during COVID. So 100 years from now, 25 years from now, we can, you might be right. But I'm betting in the next decade that in fact, India's global power capabilities are going to decline, at least relatively speaking.
Sure.
I'll take one last question if somebody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question.
Sure, I'll ask a question. Bill?
Bill?
Yes, Bill.
This is pretty naive, but and I think I know your answer, but why can Madam Meng, or however you pronounce it, have a party of 14 people, whereas you and I can't? And why don't we incarcerate her the same way as the Chinese are incarcerating our 2 Michaels? I mean, I think I know the answer, but on the other hand, and the other minor question or small question is, to what extent are Chinese students here playing a pro-China, I don't want to use the word spies, but whatever word comes into play, I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
working underground for the Chinese government?
Those are both big subjects, Bill. And on the 2 Michaels, this really does aggravate Canadians no end. As I talk with people about the case, I mean, people have different views of what should be done, et cetera, but it really gets under the craw of most Canadians, the contrast in the terms of detention between Michael and Madam Meng. Madam Meng is living a restricted life, but in a pretty wonderful atmosphere. Whereas Mike Covert, who by the way is an old friend and someone I'm deeply involved with, contacting and working as we can with him as a human being. The terms, but it's a window on the different values of our 2 societies and our approach to what we think rule of law is. The 2 Michaels are being held under terms that are standard practice in China. They're not been singled out for any kind of special detention. That is, there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people not foreigners, but Chinese prisons are pretty miserable places. And the terms of internment there are so negative. So it's a window on brutality is the wrong word. This is not a not a prison of a sort that we've seen in some other countries that are where death and attacks are regular kinds of things. Chinese prisons don't function that way. But it's a glimpse into the severity of the way that they treat prisoners in the Chinese context. Madam Meng, on the other hand, is treated as a Canadian would be, in the sense that we could be out on bail. We could be under house arrest and make certain guarantees. So it shines a window on the differences, but it really does anger people to see that, and to see some of the, I think Huawei made a real mistake in making those claims for her improved detention. This happened 2 weeks ago, a court ruling that no, she wasn't going to be able to do some other things. I'm sorry for Madam Meng's plight, but I think that the terms of her detention are not at all unfair. Whether she should be able to have 14 people for a dinner party, whether any of us should, I think we should point some shameful fingers at that. The matter of Chinese students, Bill, is a really important question, because as you framed it, in the United States, the head of the FBI described China's efforts to gather information in the United States, not just as whole of government, but whole of society. And he said that every Chinese student was an unconventional information gatherer that would be taking ideas back to China. Well, that's a pretty extreme view. And I think that we do have to recognize that there are some Chinese students, there are some Chinese visitors who work for or with security agencies, but that it is a very small number. That in our student population, a tiny percentage are involved in that game. We watch really carefully, and our Dennis Pavlich, who's on with us now, will know UBC legal on this. We watch very carefully what the Chinese consulate does with our students. They have to, some of them have to make annual reports. Those who have Chinese scholarships, it's a requirement of the scholarship that each year they give a report on what they've been doing. And we have to look at those. We don't have a formal mechanism, but we have informal mechanisms where we see those reports too. My students who are reporting, you tell me what you've reported, I ask them, and they tell me, and it's nothing to be alarmed about. But the very pretense that they, but the very fact that they have to go through this can raise suspicions. So I think your question is fundamental for us at the universities on what we're going to do to both keep eyes open for wrong behavior, to be vigilant, to be aware that it is possible and that sometimes it happens, and to be transparent, and to encourage our students to respect the rules of academic freedom, which has to do with not reporting on you, not on others. We're in that era where we're going to come to our classes sometimes and watch the tensions we have between mainland students and Hong Kong students. And there's angry words. We haven't had the problems yet that they have in Australia, where there've been pushing matches and fist fights and that sort of thing. It could happen. The passions are so high on this. We have a lot of work to do with our Chinese students and our Hong Kong students and our Taiwan students and students from several other countries where Palestine and Israel are complicated issues on our campus too. But because of the number, we've got 6,000 mainland Chinese students at UBC. And we'll probably this year have 600, I would guess, from Hong Kong. And a lot of them are young protesters. So how we're going to work out rules of the road, we're going to have to spend a lot more time on this and working with those students and with the Chinese embassy. We need some new rules of the game that are going forward to avoid what really could be, the proverbial fist fights in our classrooms and on our campus. And meantime, We have to know who our visitors from China are in a new way. Those research professors that are coming to work with us in a variety of areas, we're going to have to improve the due diligence on who they are, what their association is, and what they're actually doing when they're with us. It's not because I think most of it is reasonable, good science, good research. But we have to be able to know more and be able to tell Canadians that the interactions we're having with our Chinese counterparts are transparent and that they meet Canadian interests and standards. We've been loose on this in past, but there's no room for that anymore. And if we don't do it, it'll happen as it did in the United States, where professors are going to be arrested. They're going to be facing charges, as the head of the chemistry department is at Harvard University, because of his research connections with China. As a major professor at MIT was, there's more than 100 American professors are facing criminal charges because of their connections with Chinese counterparts. Now, I think when we look at them, there's nothing wrong that's going on there, but there are rules that that the FBI thinks are being violated. And instead of that coming here, I hope we can cut it off at the pass through awareness and transparency.
Thank you.
Sorry for a long speech, but this is one that
Thank you.
I'd like to be able to deliver to our Board of Governors. It's no longer the same world of academic and intellectual exchange. We want many of the same things, but to keep the doors open, we're going to have to close some windows and put some screens on what we do with Chinese partners, so that we can tell everyone with a straight and informed face that no, we are not violating intellectual property transfers. No, we are not violating national security. And that no, we are not allowing harassment of our students by a few people that that may have other motives.
Paul, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Men's Club and all of us in the community for your amazing talk tonight. It was informative. It was entertaining. It was everything. It was terrific. And thank you for giving up your time. It couldn't have been a better talk, really. Also, I'd like to mention, just before we all depart, at least our Zoom apps, that next month, March the 11th, Phil Dyson will be giving us a talk on Jewish role music. So very much looking forward to that, and there'll be an email coming out shortly about how that all works. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. These are strange times, and I wish you well, and stay safe. Thank you, Paul, very, very much.
Thank you for the opportunity,
Thank you.
and happy Year of the Ox.
Happy Year of the
Gung
Ox.
Ho Fat Choi. Gung Ho Fat Choi.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Paul.